Auschwitz. The very name has become synonymous with evil. For the 5 years that this Nazi concentration camp operated in southern Poland, unspeakable atrocities were committed there. More than 1 million Jews were murdered there during World War II. More than 100,000 gypsies, Christians, political prisoners, and others were also murdered by the Third Reich in this complex of camps and subcamps. In the hands of Adolf Hitler, Auschwitz became a dreadfully efficient extermination machine that was part of a diabolical plan to annihilate all Jews living in Europe. Most of those who entered the gates of Auschwitz left through the chimneys, but not everyone. What follows on this special is the stunning story of 4 brave men who miraculously broke free to tell the world about the horrors of this death camp. This is the story of the greatest escape in history from Auschwitz. Auschwitz first opened its doors in 1940 as a concentration camp, but by 1942, it had become one of 5 death camps used by the Nazis to murder people on a massive scale. Yet, until the escape of 4 Jews in the spring of 1944, few people outside the barbed wire gates knew what was really happening. At its peak performance, Auschwitz, with its gas chambers and 5 crematoriums, were operating around the clock and killed 6,000 Jews every day. The Nazis learned to streamline the process, so it took only 20 minutes to turn a human body to ash. The atrocities of Auschwitz were not reserved for those in gas chambers. The Nazis developed a living death by performing bizarre medical experiments on prisoners. Joseph Mengele was the infamous doctor who oversaw these medical procedures, many of them on twins and young children. Experiments included chemical injections, castration, and extreme exposure to cold. The prisoners inside Auschwitz wondered why the world was doing nothing to save them. Then, some of them began to think, what if they don't really know what's happening here? Joel C. Rosenberg is the author of numerous New York Times best-selling books, with more than 3 million copies in print. One of those books is The Auschwitz Escape.
I had an opportunity to go to Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp in Poland. Which is where we were staying. And there was a little book that I just stumbled on, and it was called London Has Been Informed. And I started sifting through this book, and it was about how many people had tried to escape Auschwitz. Obviously, most of them had been killed, but some had gotten out. And some had gotten out not just to save themselves, but to tell the world, the Jewish communities, as well as the Allies, what was happening in Auschwitz and these other camps. And I realized I had no idea about this. It hadn't been brought up on the tour. I hadn't learned about it in my own Jewish Holocaust education, and I was intrigued. And this set me into motion to do research, to start finding books by people who had escaped or about people who had escaped and what they'd learned and what they said and what their experiences were. In time, I began thinking, these are really important stories. How do I tell them? I hadn't really initially intended writing a book of my own, but as I thought about it more, I ended up concluding that a novel would help take people inside this hellish world of Auschwitz, but also this dramatic escape, series of escapes actually, and might cause people to say, did those things really happen? What more can I learn?
Rosenberg learned that more than 800 people tried to escape from Auschwitz, but only a few were successful. Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler were Slovak Jews. They escaped from Auschwitz on April 7, 1944. Arnost Rosen was also a Slovak Jew. Czeslaw Mordowitz was a Polish Jew. Together, they escaped from Auschwitz on May 27, 1944.
Everybody who was sent to Auschwitz as a prisoner, whether you were Jewish or a political prisoner, or Polish, Russian, whomever, obviously you wanted to get out. But what was interesting about these men was that their motivation shifted from just saving themselves to wanting to tell the world of a crime, a series of crimes that had happened there. Obviously the extermination of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Jewish people and other prisoners. But in time, before they were able to get out, their motivation shifted again from wanting to save themselves to wanting to alert the world to a crime that had happened. Now their motivation was to alert people, the world, to a crime that was about to happen, to try to stop that crime from happening. and that was the deportation of Hungarian Jews, upwards of 1 million of them, to the camps, particularly to Auschwitz, to be exterminated, to be sent to the gas chambers and the crematoria, the ovens. And now, once they had a whiff that that might happen, their motivation intensified. And when you go back and read these stories, the first-hand accounts of their own eyewitness accounts of going through this, and the stories and articles that have been written about them, it is one of the most compelling, powerful dramas. I believe these escapes from Auschwitz are the most dramatic, daring escapes in history.
These 4 men did not simply escape to save themselves. They escaped to tell the world what was really happening in Auschwitz and to urge the Allies to liberate the camp. Once they got out, they told anyone who would listen what they had seen and experienced. Jews and others who were sent to Auschwitz were stuffed into cattle cars under incredibly inhumane conditions. Disembarking at the camp was a moment of destiny. SS officers and doctors sent the young, the sick, and the elderly to the left towards the gas chambers and immediate death. Going right meant becoming a slave in the work camp. Most of these prisoners would eventually die from starvation, disease, or torture. Geoffrey Magarji is a senior applied research scholar with the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, D.C.
These were places whose primary purpose was to kill, pure and simple. Auschwitz is perhaps the best known, and it actually had a dual purpose. This is where you have that famous scene where people arrive in trains, and some of them are sent directly to the gas chamber, some of them are sent to the work camp part of Auschwitz. And there were almost 200,000 people in that section at the system's height. But most of these places were places where they were ushered directly into the gas chambers, almost all of them killed immediately upon arrival.
Verba and his fellow escapees desperately tried to get the world's attention to the genocide underway at Auschwitz. But at first, no one believed them.
I hope that in some way, this novel, The Auschwitz Escape, will help people sort of enter this world of what was the world in Europe like that led to the Holocaust? What was the thinking inside the Nazi regime? And then what was it like as a Jew or as a Christian? Because a number of Christians got sent to these camps as well. What was it like to end up there? And what would it be like to try to get out?
Today, evil is rising again. Today, radical leaders and groups are calling for the annihilation of the Jews again and the destruction of Israel. Likewise, Christians are being persecuted and killed around the world, and especially in the Middle East, like rarely before in history.
I think a lot of people don't know much about the Holocaust at all. Or if they know it, they know a little bit from school, from high school, from middle school. Hopefully they've seen Schindler's List. Maybe they've seen another film or two, but they may not know much more. But I think these particular escapes shed a lot of light on what was happening and the urgency that these men felt to tell the world what was really happening. And I think it raises a lot of interesting moral questions for today. What if you knew something was happening? How far would you go to warn other people? And once other people knew a terrible genocide was underway, how far would they go to stop it?
Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
One of the most fascinating parts of the research that I did for the Auschwitz Escape was trying to understand what did people who were Christians, who were followers of Jesus Christ, not in name only, but but people who really loved Christ and loved God's Word and were committed to the Lord. What did they do? Did any of them help? And in many ways, I feel like I entered this process fearing that nobody did anything. I know that many did, but I didn't know a lot of specific stories. I'm familiar, of course, with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Many of us are, in part because of Eric Metaxas's recent, really powerful biography of Bonhoeffer, a German Lutheran pastor who defied the Nazis, developed underground seminary and trained pastors underground to help keep the church truly preaching the actual gospel of Jesus Christ and not letting it be corrupted by the Nazis who were trying to take over the established churches in Germany, the state-run churches. So his work is very, very important. But there's so much more. So many more Christians actually were engaged both in standing for the truth and rescuing Jewish people. One of the most fascinating stories to me that I came across while writing the Auschwitz Escape was the story of a Protestant Christian community in France, in a little community called Le Chambon. Le Chambon is in south-central France. At the time, during World War II, it was in what was called Vichy France. The Nazis had rolled in and invaded France, but then they had occupied the northern tier and Paris. But they had set up a puppet government, in a sense, to run the rest of France, South France. And the Vichy government was sort of supportive of the Nazis, but they weren't really Nazis themselves. So there was a degree of freedom in Vichy France that just, that was some ways called Free France. It wasn't totally free, but it was freer than obviously Nazi control of France. This community of Protestant pastors and Christian leaders began to discover that Jewish people were escaping from the rest of Europe, from Germany and Poland and elsewhere, and they began to resolve amongst themselves to rescue these Jewish people. In the end, all of the pastors were arrested and sent to concentration camps. One of them was sent to one of the worst camps and eventually died there of exhaustion and sickness. The others were eventually released, but why were they arrested? They were arrested for their faith, but they were arrested because they put their faith into action to rescue Jewish people. And eventually the State of Israel and the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Israel awarded each of these leaders righteous Gentile status. They call it righteous among the nations. These are people who are not Jewish, but risk their own lives to rescue Jewish people during the Holocaust and the whole Nazi years. And not only were the pastors awarded this, eventually the State of Israel awarded a special recognition to every single member of that town, Le Chambon, and its surrounding communities, about 5,000 people, because they had rescued more than 3,000 Jewish people. It's only one of 2 towns in the entire continent of Europe that the entire population was awarded this special recognition by the Israeli government. There are tragically many people in the world who just refuse to believe that 6 million Jewish people were systematically executed in what was called the final solution at the behest of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime.
Bernice Weisbart-Frank serves at the Holocaust Museum in Miami.
The Germans built crematoriums, they built Auschwitz, they built gas chambers. The Nazi conference taught them, the elimination of the Jews in the best way possible. They were supposed to get rid of 11 million Jews. They're going to get rid of 6. Each one of my parents had over 100 relatives, and they all perished. So almost 300 relatives perished from our family.
Paul Goff is an Auschwitz survivor living in Miami with vivid memories of his concentration camp experiences.
In April of 1940, we were all sent to a ghetto. They called it the Lichmannstadt Ghetto in 1945 August. I, with my mother, was sent out to Auschwitz, and there were 263,000 people in that ghetto. And I think by the time we were sent, there were about 10,000 left. My mother was sent to the crematorium.
Existence at Auschwitz was cruel, brutal, unfair, and usually short. Food rations and work conditions were designed by the Nazis as a living death sentence, driving prisoners to the extremes of human behavior.
Then I was sent to Ravensbrück. It was a awful place. There was filth and dirt and hunger. There was no food whatsoever in that place. but there were stacks of dead bodies, and people were using it to survive. Cannibalism. Germany. They were the most intelligent, most educated people in Europe. It was unbelievable that human being can do that to human beings.
Once the men who actually escaped from Auschwitz did in fact get out and get into safe hands, they immediately wrote a document, they collaborated on a document describing in detail what was happening in Auschwitz, laying out the map of the camps themselves, and explaining in great detail what was happening with the systematic extermination of the Jewish people. The gas chambers, the ovens, the whole thing. The document became known as the Auschwitz Protocol, and it was being drafted in the spring to early summer of 1944, after these men escaped and got to freedom in Czechoslovakia. What happened then is this document was then translated and copies were sent to the Jewish communities in Hungary to warn them to the Jewish people shouldn't get on these trains. It was sent to various intelligence services for the British and the Americans and so forth. And eventually got to London and eventually got to Washington and attracted the attention of the top leadership in the United States, including the president. The question at that point becomes very interesting. What did the leaders of the world do with this? The short version is it's a huge controversy over whether they did enough. Now, some will argue, and some do argue, that no, the leaders of the Western powers, the Allies, learned exactly what was happening from eyewitnesses in the camps. They should have bombed the railroad tracks heading into Auschwitz and the other extermination camps. Or some Jewish leaders at the time were even saying, just go ahead and bomb the camps. These people are doomed to die, but destroy the camps so that no one else can die. The United States didn't do that, nor did the British or any of the other allies.
My opinion is, and I've read many different things of it about this, is that we had people in the State Department that made sure that a lot of information was not gotten to the administrators that were able to do things about it. And where there was anti-Semitism within the government. And yes, why did they not bomb the routes to Auschwitz? Why did they not do more? Why did they not, when they had the conference, in Avion, why did only Costa Rica take Jews in and the United States, Canada, no one else took Jews in to try to save them? Why? Well, there was anti-Semitism everywhere.
Some argue this shows the total failure of moral understanding of the Allied leadership. Now, others will push back at that and say, listen, the United States and the Brits, among others, right, at the moment that this information was emerging, were preparing for the D-Day invasion. All their energy and resources were to defeat the Nazis by establishing a beachhead in France. And so they will argue that it's unfair to argue that somehow that all was not enough, that the Allies weren't serious about rescuing not just Jews but everybody in Europe and winning the war. And that is a debate that will go on for some time. And I think it's an important debate because later we learned that the Allies did bomb a factory that was right nearby Auschwitz that was making plastics and rubber and artificial rubber. And so people argue, if you could bomb a factory near Auschwitz, why couldn't you bomb the railroad tracks or the camps?
And the argument that came into play was that the best way to help the people in the camps is to win the war as quickly as possible. I think the bottom line is that it would have been important to do for symbolic reasons. It would have been important to make a statement that we know what you're doing there and we oppose it and we're going to interfere with it to some extent. I don't think that interference could have been effective. Bombing railroads is something that we were doing in other parts of Europe, and frankly, railroads can be repaired very, very quickly.
when you have certain information, what should world leaders do? What is the moral thing to do? How and when do you take decisive action when millions of people's lives lie in the balance?
I also believe that if the Nazis had not been able to get the Jews to Auschwitz, and we're talking mostly about the Hungarian Jews, most of the Jews who were going to die in the Holocaust were already dead by the time our bombers could get to Poland. So there was a limited amount that we could do. And I think if we had cut the routes to Auschwitz, if we had bombed the gas chambers, the Germans simply would have found another way to kill those people. In the end, I don't know how many people it would have saved, and there was the argument that we needed those bombers to hit other targets. And there's no denying that in many parts of the US government and the military, there was strong anti-Semitism in that era. There were people who didn't really care particularly what was going on, what the Nazis were doing with the Jews.
We head towards the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, which occurred in January 1945. These are very important anniversaries, and it's important for all people to think about what happened in history, why did it happen, and what are the lessons that we ought to learn in our country and for our leadership as we go forward. The further we get away from the events of 1944 or 45, the whole period of the Holocaust, which really began with Auschwitz sort of being set into motion in the early 40s, 40, 41, the further we get away from that, the bigger the risk that people will forget. Or that if they know the term Auschwitz, they know the idea of the Holocaust, maybe they saw Schindler's List, but maybe their parents saw it and they didn't. They heard about it in school. Anyway, this is a risk that we will forget the history or not really study it enough anyway, and then forget the lessons if we ever learn them.
I think one of the most important lessons that we can learn from the Holocaust is how gradually it started. If German society as a whole, or some large part of it, had stood up at that point and said, no, this is wrong, I don't believe the Nazis could have done what they eventually did.
Again, one of my desires for writing the Auschwitz Escape was to try to, refocus a degree of attention on these issues, because I don't think they're just about the past. I believe that we live at a time where a great evil, a terrible evil, is rising once again. And I think that, as the first line of the novel says, evil, unchecked, is the prelude to genocide. If you don't stop evil, if you don't confront it, if you don't stop it early, it grows, it expands, the cruelty, the demonic nature of an evil idea or regime expands. It wants more. It comes to rob, kill, and destroy as much as it possibly can. And so when evil is unchecked, eventually it will lead to genocide. And there are a number of applications in our time, and I hope that people will talk about sort of lessons from this novel, from this era, for our time.
Rosenberg is a former aide to several Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Natan Sharansky, now head of the Jewish Agency. He says the lessons of Holocaust have direct applications in today's geopolitical environment.
One of them I would just raise is an issue that I've raised in my other books, and that is if Iran in fact gets nuclear weapons and has the missiles to deliver them, will they set out to bring about a second Holocaust? Iranian leaders in the past have said we want to wipe Israel off the map. Israel is a nation of about 8 million people, 6 million of whom are Jews. And so as I've said in the past, as I've written in the past, if the leaders of Iran get nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them, high-speed ballistic missiles, they will be able to do in about 6 minutes what it took Adolf Hitler nearly 6 years to do, and that is to kill 6 million people. That is just a stunning and horrifying thought, because the Iranian regime says they're going to wipe Israel off the map.
Zizi Abedini is someone who knows firsthand about the threat posed by totalitarian leaders in Iran. Her brother, Saeed Abedini, has been in prison for 2 years for his Christian faith. Zizi is also a Christian, and she can never return to her home in Iran.
Yeah, I was born in Iran and raised in an Islamic family. I was in Iran, I educated in Iran. I didn't know anything about Holocaust because they never mentioned about it in our history, in Islamic history. And when Ahmadinejad mentioned that Holocaust never happened, that word stuck in my mind, and I saw Google, what is Holocaust? I didn't know anything about Holocaust, and then I find out what's happened to Jewish people that time.
From Iran to Syria and Iraq to China and North Korea, evil is rising in our time. Christians, Jews, and others are being targeted, put into prisons, and even concentration camps. They are also being murdered. Is the world confronting such evil decisively?
And what if an evil power rises again that tries to kill 6 million Jews? That's a horrible thought, but we have to remember that the killing of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust wasn't Hitler's ultimate objective. He had a final solution for the Jews, but he wanted to kill or enslave everyone in Europe and everyone on the planet. Evil doesn't stop once it kills off one people group. And I think as the American people, we're tired of war. We've been engaged in war and military operations in the Middle East for a long time. But we have to keep in mind, and evil is rising. One of my hopes is that pastors and Christian leaders across the United States, Canada, but really around the world will read the book, but will also really think through what more can we be doing. But also there are opportunities to think through moral questions on a wide range of fronts. How do we face genocide in this world? What is a Christian's responsibility? And when we say never forget about the Holocaust or never again, we also have to ask ourselves and our leaders, how far would you go to stop another Holocaust?